Hey everyone, welcome back to Love Wins, where the truth matters because it's the truth that sets us free. All right, I apologize. This video is coming out late. I filmed yesterday 4 times. Finally got to film all the way through without the software cutting out. And then I edited the whole thing and I exported it and the file was corrupted. Couldn't do anything with it. So here I am starting over. Just got back from church and I'm hoping to get this out for you this evening. And I don't want to be dramatic, but I'm not surprised that it didn't go well yesterday. I won't be surprised if this doesn't go well today. I have committed in my heart to doubling down on what I believe needs to happen. I started this channel 2 years ago-ish, frustrated and angry that my own denomination is mired in decades plus of believing that our eternal destiny is dependent on our performance and our behavior and our own perfection, etc., etc. It's not the gospel, and it's frustrating to me that our church believes that we have been called by God to share the gospel with the world, which desperately needs it, yet we don't even know what it is ourselves. But my new conviction is, rather than lament what the problem is, I'm going to focus on what the solution is. And that is understanding who Jesus is, why he came, what he's about, what he's like, what he accomplished, what he's doing now, what he will do, all of his promises, and where we fit into all that. Because if we knew who we were, where we came from, why we're here, what our purpose is, and where we're going, many problems would be solved inside the church and outside the church. And by church, I mean Christianity. What is happening is that Christianity has lost its way, lost our focus on Jesus, and is becoming a militant, political, power-seeking entity. And that is going to go nowhere good. History has shown it over and over. Now, I believe the issue starts with, number 1, are we reading the Bible? And number 2, when we read the Bible, how are we reading it? Okay? So people generally fall loosely into one of 2 camps. One camp thinks the Bible is every single word is directly from God. No mistakes. No interpretation needed. Take it all literal. It's not right. It's not true. The other extreme is, read it, maybe don't read it. It's all symbolic. It's all allegory. It's all metaphor. None of it's real. Adam and Eve didn't really exist, etc., etc. I want to read for you. We're going to focus mostly today on a story from the Old Testament. And I'm telling you right now, this video is only part 1 of several. And I know series don't really work on YouTube, but there's no other way to do it other than make a 10-hour video, and I'm not doing that. So, Gospel of John is the last of the 4. It is the most intense of the 4. It has a completely different focus and flavor. It is John's main concern is helping us understand who Jesus is. So he begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word, Jesus, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him nothing was made that was made. So Jesus isn't just a good teacher. He's not just a prophet. He's not just a good person. He is God in human flesh. And so you skip down to 14. It says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. There's also this theme of light and darkness. That'll be for a future video, but he introduces that also in chapter 1. Then in chapter 1, he makes this incredible statement, which you rarely hear anyone ever talk about. It is perhaps one of the most significant statements, not only in the Gospel of John, but in the entire New Testament. And that's not an exaggeration. He says this. Verse 16, and of his fullness, of Jesus' fullness, we have all received, and grace for grace, which is probably better translated as grace upon grace. Then verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. In other words, without Jesus, there is no way to find the truth. You can read the words from Genesis to Malachi in the Old Testament. You won't find the truth because the truth is only found through Jesus. In fact, in John 5:39, he's told the Jews, you search the scriptures, the words, diligently, thinking that in them you have eternal life, but these testify of me. In other words, they were treating the Bible as a code book. If we could just figure out what God wants and do it right, he would be obligated to give us the rewards that we want. It's not the story. So Jesus says, they testify of me. And in John chapter 1, he said, the law came through Moses. The words came through Moses. But grace and truth came through Jesus. Without Jesus, you don't have the necessary perspective, information, lens by which to understand the rest. That's a big statement. So what that means is the book is not like other books. You can't understand it just by reading it. You have to understand it through the person of Jesus. In other words, we don't interpret who Jesus is and what he's like by the Old Testament. We interpret the Old Testament by Jesus. I'm going to share this. I didn't plan to, but I'm going to share this. Ty Gibson is a fantastic writer. He's a good preacher. He now has a church online called Storyline Church. It's in person too, but they put all their things online. Ty was an atheist until he was 18 or 19. And he was an atheist because he looked at the world and he thought, if there's a God out there who has the power to create this world, but it leaves it in the mess that it's in, he's either wildly incompetent or diabolical. And I want nothing to do with him. And he uses the example of, like, he didn't have much money, no dad, mom was poor. He said, but if there were 3 starving children on my front lawn that I had no idea who they were, I would bring them in my house and do everything I could to help them and feed them. So where's God? Then a preacher came to their house. And he first studied with the mom, and she got baptized and became a believer. And then his girlfriend, who lived with them, she studied, got baptized. And then he moved on to Ty. And Ty said, listen, my mom's gullible, my girlfriend's gullible, I'm not gullible, I don't believe in God, it's a bunch of nonsense, you're wasting your time, you're wasting my time, leave me alone. And the preacher said, listen, I'm going to give you this book. It was a big book. I just want you to read the first chapter. If you tell me you read the first chapter and you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to have me come back anymore, talk to you anymore, I'll leave you alone. But if you read the first chapter and you want to talk about it, I'll come back and we'll talk about it. So because his mom had already got baptized and his girlfriend had gotten baptized and they were the only 2 people in the world he cared about and he wanted to know what was going on, he read the first chapter. And he said the title was The Origin of Sin or something like that. And of course he's had no idea sin. He had no church background whatsoever, so the word sin didn't mean much to him. But as he read the chapter, he understood that it's the bad stuff. When he got through the chapter, he said he didn't understand more than 80% of what he read because of the terminology and the language or whatever. But he got this out of it. And he became a believer. And here's why. Ty had spent his entire life assuming that God, if he existed, that his whole realm was based on power. That God should just do through his power whatever needed to be done. But as he read that chapter, he realized God's essence and the way he operates is love. and that love requires freedom, and that freedom involves risk. In other words, just as parents decide to have children, they know those children are going to grow up to make whatever choices they choose to make, which is very risky, but that's the way it is. And it might turn out great, and it may turn out mediocre, it may turn out terrible. But the only way to make your kids into what you want, if you had enough money and enough power, is to control them. And God doesn't control. It's not based on power. So when we read the Bible, the assumptions that we make about God when we start, or from the Christian background or religious background that we have, or whatever ideology we were raised with, has a huge impact on what we read and how we read it. For people who want to be faithful to the Bible, they think being faithful means if I read a verse and the verse says God said do this and they did it, they assume that must be true. And therefore, whatever God told them to do says something about God. Here's the problem. Many people struggle, and I just had another person come to me last week about this. Many people struggle with Jesus versus the God of the Old Testament. So they say Jesus is kind and nice, but the God of the Old Testament is dark and warlike and threatening and controlling and etc. But God and Jesus, they're the same. Jesus said, if you've seen me, also in the Gospel of John, you've seen God. You're not going to find a difference. You know how kids will try and play off their parents? They'll ask one parent if they can do something. That parent says no, so then they don't tell the other parent that they've already asked, and they ask again, hoping that they'll get a different answer and play the parents off each other. You're not going to get that with Jesus and God. They're the same. You're going to get the same answer every time, all the time. Because in character, they are the same. So the story that I want to look at today is in the Old Testament. It's in the book of Judges. And I call Judges the book of the flushing toilet. And the reason I call it that is because when the book of Judges opens, things are going, as far as this world goes, reasonably well. And then it just starts spiraling. And by the end of the book, it says there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. It was chaos. The climax of the chaos comes in chapter 19. There's only 21 chapters. In chapter 19, there is a horrific story. And the story begins with, it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but a Levite, that's the priestly tribe. There's 12 tribes in Israel. The Levites are the priests. So they're the holy tribe. They're the closest to God. They're the ones who are supposed to be upholding truth and righteousness and all that stuff. So for a Levite to have a concubine, that's a no-go. That shouldn't be happening. A concubine is someone who is like a wife, but you haven't married her. It's, today we would call it maybe common law. Shouldn't be happening. A Levite should have one wife. He should be fully married to her, and it should be a healthy, happy relationship. That's how it should be. So the fact that a Levite has a concubine shows you that society is adrift, that things are not going well. So also this past week, someone sent me a story of a young girl. I'm not going to say her name or the place because I hope someday she'll come to realize that this is not a good choice and make better choices. Anyway, she's running an OnlyFans business, which if you don't know what that is, awesome. If you do know what that is, you know what I'm saying. And she claims to be an active Christian and claims that she sees no issue between those two things. Also last week, someone who is what she calls herself a new evangelical. In other words, she still believes in Jesus, still believes in the Bible, still considers herself a Christian, but doesn't buy into the trajectory that mainline evangelicals are on. Namely, the biggest issue she has is this move towards Christian nationalism. And so she started a podcast, and she's sharing her new beliefs, and she has supposed Christians sending her death threats. So Christianity today it's not just adrift, but it's drifting further and picking up speed in the drift, like seemingly daily. Same situation in the book of Judges. It started out pretty good. America started out pretty good. Christianity has had a good run for a while. Not recently, but for a while. And Judges are spiraling. Things here are spiraling. So this Levite has a concubine. And it says that she played the harlot and she went away to her father's house. Now, that makes it sound like she's the issue. But if you actually dig into the Hebrew and read the story in its context, it sounds like the reason why it's saying she played the harlot is just because she left. But it sounds like she left for her own safety and her own well-being. Because she doesn't run off with another man. She doesn't run off and run some scandalous lifestyle. She goes home to her own parents. And then it says after a while, he decides to go get her and try and convince her to come home. Anyway, this is Judges 19. You can read the story. I'm not going to get into all the gory details. In the end, he goes to get her, spends some time there. The father tries to convince the couple to stay, his daughter and her husband. Finally, the husband says, no, I'm leaving. So takes her and goes. So on their way home, they have to stay overnight. They have a choice between an Israelite town and a non-Israelite town. So they choose the Israelite town because it's supposed to be safer. Well, it ends up not being safe at all. And I'm not going to get into the gory details. But what ends up happening is, the short story is that he sends her out and she gets gang assaulted. And they let her go towards morning, and she finds her way back to the house where they're staying. And I'm just going to read for you what happens at that point to give you a taste of how cold-hearted this guy is. Okay? So it says, they abused her all night until morning. When the day began to break, they let her go. The woman came as the day was breaking, fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, so he doesn't know where she is, he's not attempting to find out where she is, he's just going to go home. There was his concubine, fallen at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. Now you can imagine what she looks like. Verse 28. He said to her, "Get up and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went home. Didn't take her to a clinic if they had such a thing. Didn't take her to the local whoever who might have some medical knowledge. No, throws her on the donkey and takes her home. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, divided her body into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel, one piece to each tribe. This man is cold. And then he builds a case that he's been the victim, that this is terribly unjust, and that justice needs to be served. So when Israel hears what has happened, they are justifiably horrified, but of course they've only heard his side of the story. And now I'm going to read you the opening of what they decide to do. This is chapter 20, verse 1. So all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, as well as from the land of Gilead, and the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. And the leaders of all the people and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. Then the children of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this wicked deed happen?" So the reason why now Benjamin is being separated out, it's one of the 12 tribes, but it's not, that tribe is not present. And the reason why that tribe is not present is because the town in which this atrocity occurred was inside the tribe of Benjamin. It was a Benjamite town. So what you have erupting here is a civil war. 11 of the tribes are going to go up against the one tribe to avenge what has happened to this man by what happened to his concubine. So what's your point? My point is, when you, and I'm not going to sit here and read the whole story to you because you can read, but I am going to highlight some stuff. When you read the story, the two groups go to war. There's 3 distinct battles. Israel loses the first 2. They win the third one. And I put win in quotation marks because I don't believe anybody wins when we handle things this way. My point is, when Israel went to war against Benjamin, they believed they were doing the will of God. They presented it as if they were doing the will of God. But when they came to seek God, to inquire of the Lord, which is how it words it here, if you read it, there were 400,000 foot soldiers with their swords ready. They didn't truly come to inquire of God. They decided what they were going to do before they ever got there. These people are not seeking the will of God. They're following their own will, and they're asking God's blessing upon it. Those are 2 very different things. So there's a lot of places in the Old Testament where when you read that God said this, or God was in favor of this, or God was supporting this, or however it happens to read, is it really God, or is it Israel's doing what they want to do, what they think God wants them to do, and crediting it to God? 2 very different things. So after the first day, 11 tribes against 1, and the 11 tribes lose badly. 26,000, I think, of them die. No Benjamites die. So they come back to the Lord, weeping. Like, what happened? Like, we're on your side, you're on our side, what happened? Should we go up against our brother Benjamin again? They never called Benjamin their brother the first time. So now they're feeling some remorse. They're feeling some acknowledgement that maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But God tells them to go again. At least that's how it reads. And they lose again. I don't remember when David went up against Goliath. I don't remember David losing twice before he won. Like if a cause is truly just, and sometimes I believe in history, I believe that stopping Hitler was a necessary war. I don't favor war. I don't think it's a good thing, but sometimes, because of the way the world is, what I'm trying to get across to you is you cannot surface read the Bible. You can't. By the time you read Judges 19, 20, and 21, it becomes clear that Israel is doing their own thing and dragging God's name into it. By the end of the book, they're blaming everything on the fact that they don't have a king. Then you come to 1 Samuel, and God raises up Samuel. He's a good prophet. Things go better for a while because this flushing toilet, it's not all down, it's around and then down. But then Samuel's coming towards the end of his life, and the people see that there's no future there, and his sons are not like him. There's no future there, and they ask for a king. They look at all the other nations around them who have kings and are more successful than they are, and they want a king. And Samuel says, no, you have a king. God is your king. But then God says to Samuel, Samuel, Let them have a king. Give them what they want. But tell them what the cost will be. Tell them what the consequences will be. Tell them how it's going to go ahead of time. You say, well, why would God give Israel permission to do something that he knows is going to be a disaster? Because his kingdom is based on love, which necessitates freedom, which involves risk. And the only way Israel is ever going to serve God freely in the right way is if they have the freedom to do things the wrong way. Just because God gives us permission to do something, like Israel attacking Benjamin or getting a king, does not mean that God supports either one of those things. Doesn't mean that it's what he wants. Doesn't mean that it's plan A or B or even C or D. It just means that God sees where we're at and says, listen, if you need to fall on your face in order to realize that your ideas are bad, then I guess you're going to have to fall on your face. But when we read history the way it happened and assume that because Israel is God's people and that's the way they did things, then that must be God's will. No, it's Israel's will. Second king of Israel is David, the big hero. And if you read his story from the beginning to the end, he's anything but a hero. Has major issues, moral flaws, and etc. Anyways, David's a warring king. And after he has won or created enough success that he can have some peace, he tells the prophet Nathan that he wants to build God's sanctuary, the temple, a permanent structure to replace the tent that Moses built in the wilderness. And Nathan's like, oh yeah, great idea. And then God comes to Nathan the prophet and says, no, it's not a great idea. David's not going to build my house. There's too much blood on his hands. Now, if God was a warring God in favor of genocide and war and murder and atrocities and all those things, he would have applauded David. He would have had David build his temple. But instead he says, no, there's too much blood on his hands. That he's not, his kind of leadership and how he got to where he is not how I operate. He does not represent me. So he's not going to build my house. You say, well, that's a new perspective. But it's a biblical perspective. You see, when we're honest with the whole story and we're not just picking and choosing, like when you hear atheists who are rabidly anti-Bible and rabidly anti-Christian, they will selectively pull stories out without the context on either side of those stories, without the bigger picture in mind. And they'll use those stories to make God look like a monster. But let me remind you again, John chapter 1 says, the story, the words, the law came through Moses. The book came through Moses. Torah came through Moses. But grace and truth came through Jesus. You can get the story from Moses, but you'll never see the truth in it without Jesus. You can read all about the monarchy of Saul and David and Solomon and so on and so forth, and you can memorize it if you want to, but you'll never understand it without Jesus. You will come to false conclusions without Jesus. You will make a mess of it without Jesus. And the reason why I'm embarking on this series is because Christianity today is making a mess of it, and it's going to get worse. It is getting worse. It's rapidly getting worse because they've lost the script. They have the stories, they have ideologies, but they don't have Jesus. You say, well, they say they do. They do say they do. Just like the Israelites who killed Jesus believed that they were doing God a favor, that they were defending the church, that they were helping God out, that they were giving God a hand. Killed his son. Jesus said The day will come when people will kill you, warning his own disciples. The day will come when people will kill you and think they're doing God a service. Just because people rise up in the name of God does not mean God has anything to do with what they're rising up about. So in Judges 20, when Israel rose up and started a civil war against the tribe of Benjamin, God was not in that. That was not his idea. They came with swords drawn before they even got to God to even ask him about it. What God did tell them was to send Judah first, the tribe of Judah, one tribe against one tribe. Why Judah? Well, that's for another video, but there's a very specific reason why God said Judah first. There was a lesson in that. If they had paused and thought about their own history and how this spiraling out of control began, they would have realized God has a message in that. We shouldn't be doing this. But unfortunately, the Bible says that reverence for God is the beginning of wisdom. And when you flip that around, when we don't revere God, it's the beginning of insanity. And they came angry, swords at the ready, before God ever had a chance to say boo about it. So what are you really saying? What am I really saying? If you want to be a follower of Jesus, you need to get serious about finding out who Jesus really is. Because you know and I know that you can ask 10 different churches and get 10 different answers. You can watch 10 different YouTube channels and get 10 different perspectives. Keep in mind, I'm not selling you anything. I'm not asking you to join anything. I'm not asking anything from you. I'm here for one reason and one reason only. I believe Jesus is the answer to the ache of every human heart. But it has to be the real Jesus, not the man-made Jesus who we prop up to support and give credibility to our own human causes. Not that Jesus. Jesus is not a warring person. He's not a political person. His kingdom is not of this world. It's not like this world. So I'm committed from here on for a while to slowly and with great detail show to the best of my ability who the Jesus of the Bible is. Because if we think that things like what happened to Jesus at the hands of the church, what happened in the Dark Ages in Europe at the hands of the church, what happened in Judges at the hands of the church, if we think that that cannot repeat itself in our day and our time, we are fooling ourselves. And the only antidote to make sure that it doesn't happen is for people who call themselves Christians to actually know who Christ is. Because I'm telling you right now, a lot of the nonsense going on in Christianity would come to a grinding halt if people who think they're Christians actually knew Christ. You say, well, that's a big statement. It is a big statement. It is. But there is only one Jesus. And that's why I keep telling you, encouraging you, pleading with you. Read Matthew, read Mark, read Luke, read John. I'm not asking you to read anything my church puts out. I'm not asking you to read anything any other religious organization puts out. I'm asking you to read the story of Jesus from his book. The words of the Old Testament came through Moses. But to understand the grace of God and the truth about God, you find that through Jesus. I know this was a lot for one video. I'm encouraging you to come back, not to listen, not to believe what I say, but so that I can maybe encourage you. Maybe you'll hear something that will help you on your journey of discovering who he is for yourself. We'll see you next time.